Shabbat Shalom. As a little kid, I used to hate brushing my teeth. One morning, I was being particularly stubborn, and my dad, likely at the end of his rope, issued some sort of ultimatum. "Fine," I yelled, "but I'm only brushing the bottom ones." God bless my parents for dealing with me. Perhaps because of my stubbornness and propensity to negotiate even as a first grader, my lawyer dad thought I was bound to follow in his footsteps. "Are you sure about this?" he asked me when I told him about rabbinical school. "You have so much fire and passion and a desire to change the world. Wouldn't you rather go to law school?" He's right, I do have fire and passion and a desire to change the world, which I told him. But I also told him that I'd rather do that through rabbinical school. And 5 years later, I stand by my words. This week, I'm joined by more than 1,200 Jewish communities across the country who are also looking to our Jewish tradition out of their own desire to challenge the status quo. This Shabbat, as I mentioned earlier, is Reproductive Shabbat, or Repro Shabbat for short. This yearly event is organized by the National Council of Jewish Women, NCJW, to celebrate reproductive freedom as a Jewish value. And while reproductive freedom is a Jewish value all year long, this particular Shabbat is designated as Repro Shabbat because of this week's Torah portion, Shabbat Mishpatim. Among the 23 imperative commandments and 30 prohibitions listed in this parshah, we learn the law that becomes the basis for Judaism's position on abortion. Jewish law holds that abortion is not only permissible, but on occasion is required. The verse reads, "In a case where men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, the one responsible shall be fined accordingly, the payment to be based on reckoning." In other words, in a situation where a woman is, God forbid, injured by someone to the point of miscarrying, the perpetrator is responsible for monetary payment. Now, the logic of our rabbis here is a little bit convoluted, so stick with me for a second. Because the perpetrator is only responsible for a monetary payment and not the capital punishment resulting from committing murder, halachic authorities deduce that the value of a fetus is not equal to the value of a human life. Essentially, the verse says that a person doesn't get capital punishment for causing the death of a fetus. Therefore, that person has not committed murder, and consequently, a fetus isn't a person, and a mother's life takes precedent. It's a little bit complicated, but the bottom line, as indicated in Jewish discourse across centuries, is abortion is a Jewish right. On the one hand, I could not be prouder that this verse is part of our Jewish tradition. My first grade self might have been a little bit misguided around the merits of toothbrushing, but I do retain that deep desire for bodily autonomy and the ability to make choices for myself. I am proud to say that this verse leads our Jewish tradition in saying unequivocally, abortion is a Jewish right. On the other hand, my stubborn self, the same stubborn self that insisted I would only brush the bottom ones, says that this verse is not exactly the pinnacle of feminism. It centers the men who are fighting. It ignores the suffering and the pain that comes from having a miscarriage. So this verse is not the verse that I want to focus on this Repro Shabbat. It's important, it's foundational, and it's not where I derive the wisdom and the chizuk, the strength, the spiritual strength that I need to remember and to fight for the fact that abortion is a Jewish right. Instead, I want to turn our attention to Masechet Sanhedrin, the tractate of rabbinic literature that addresses the judicial system. This is, after all, the first Repro Shabbat since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This is the first Repro Shabbat where I have felt truly terrified that my rights to my own body are in the hands of the courts. As we sit here, a Texas lawsuit threatens the future of one of the most common abortion methods nationwide, even in states where voters have rejected abortion bans and where abortion rights are protected by state law. The reality is that courts matter. Courts matter to us now, and courts matter to the rabbis responsible for creating Judaism as we know it. Tractate Sanhedrin records the details of the judicial system that these rabbis set up. It teaches us how to select judges and form a court, how to accept testimony, how to mete out punishment. And in one of my favorite sugyas or sections, Sanhedrin teaches us, in a Sanhedrin, that is the Jewish equivalent of the Supreme Court, where if all of the judges saw fit to convict the defendant in a case of capital punishment, they acquit the defendant. In other words, if all 71 judges on the Sanhedrin found a man guilty and deserving of capital punishment, that person would go free. The Talmud goes on to ask the question that you might be asking yourself. Why? Wouldn't unanimity all the more so indicate guilt? The answer is that the court must contain dissenting voices. If everyone is thinking the same way, then justice is not being served. Underlying this text is a value. A homogeneous court is a dangerous court. A court that only views evidence through one lens, that only accepts one truth, is a court so irresponsible and so suspect that it cannot issue judgment at all. Here, Masechet Sanhedrin and our Jewish tradition is telling us that a homogeneous court cannot be accepted. But as of right now, in our federal courts, 74% of all sitting judges are white, with white men making up 60% of the federal bench. In 20 states, there are no justices who identify as a person of color, and this includes, by the way, 12 states where people of color make up at least 20% of the population. In 9 states, there is only one woman sitting on the Supreme Court bench. 39% of sitting justices are former prosecutors, and only 7% are former public defenders. Talk about a homogeneous court. This is, honestly, appalling. It's appalling in the eyes of our sacred text, and it is appalling in the eyes of the modern public. Not just to me, by the way. Research has demonstrated that a diverse judiciary is important for increasing public trust and confidence in the courts, particularly among historically underrepresented communities. And it's not just perception either. This lack of trust is warranted. Research shows that demographic and professional diversity among judges enriches judicial deliberations and impacts the development of the law. In simple terms, a more diverse court is more just. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Zichrona Livracha, taught that real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. We can take those steps. And it can start as simply as this. Pay attention. As our central Jewish prayer, the Shema, calls us to do, Shema Israel. Listen up, people of Israel. Pay attention. Pay attention to the courts, not just to the Supreme Courts, to the county courts and the state courts. Pay attention to the cases before they make it all the way up the ladder. Learn about the Massachusetts judicial branch. Educate yourself about who's in power and who is not. Judges confirmed to lifetime seats on federal courts have the power to influence every aspect of public policy. They make decisions every day about healthcare, bodily autonomy, voting rights, the environment, civil rights, and these decisions impact our lives and the lives of further generations. And we have the power to determine who gets elected. So the next time your ballot includes a list of judges, Shema Israel, pay attention. Look down the ballot. Look to organizations like NCJW for wisdom and do your research. Masechet Sanhedrin tells us not only about the general makeup of the courts, but about the specific qualifications for what makes a good judge. And it is quite the list. Rabbi Yochanan says, according to the Masechet, they place on the Sanhedrin, on this court, only people of high stature and of wisdom, and of pleasant appearance, and of suitable age so that they will be respected. And they also must be masters of sorcery, and they must know all 70 languages, in order that the Sanhedrin will not need to hear testimony from the mouth of a translator in a case where a witness speaks a different language. This list is long. It's a little bit ridiculous. I honestly can't imagine, as wonderful as the rabbis were, them finding even one person that met these qualifications, let alone 71, the number that made up that grand court. And yet what's amazing and beautiful about this to me is that our rabbis are still willing to imagine a world in which a court this qualified is possible. The rabbis were striving for this kind of world even while holding that impossibility. So as I stand here, a little bit terrified about the future of the courts, scared about the way that what my rights are threatened as a woman, as a queer person, as a Jew, this text reminds me to continue to imagine, to not let the current reality get me down, to demand with the ferocity and chutzpah of a first grader refusing to brush their top teeth that abortion is a Jewish right. My parents may have regretted it a little bit in that moment when I was standing there demanding that I get to brush my teeth my way. But they raised me to think that what I had to say mattered. They cultivated within me the chutzpah to stand up for myself, to stand up for others, and to stand up for my community. And it's with that same chutzpah that I stand before you, with that same strength that I say again and again, it's in our tradition, it's in our hearts, it's in our texts over and over. Abortion is a Jewish right. So wherever you find your own chizuk, your own strength, whether it's in the words of our Torah, the words of our rabbinic literature, the words of people in your life, I invite you to call on that strength. To yourself, stand up and say, with that same stubbornness and assertiveness as my first grade self, abortion is a Jewish right. Thank you.